Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session. My name is Francisco and my partner Griselda are part of Gabe's team. Today, along with my colleague, we'll be supporting you with any questions and monitoring the chat throughout the session. I will also be the session's timekeeper, so you may hear the bell or a verbal reminder when the time is coming to an end. And I'm excited to introduce our presenter. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Naomi Kinjo, she's a Japanese English bilingual classroom teacher from Glendale, California. Naomi has received her master's in bicultural childhood education from Teachers College, Columbia University in May of 2015. She currently teaches at a Japanese English dual language program in Glendale, Southern California. As a daughter of a Japanese mother and American father, she has personal experience growing up immersed in a bilingual bicultural environment. Her interests include her identity development of mixed race children, social justice and education, and the intersectionality of language, culture, and race. Welcome, Naomi.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us on a Saturday morning. I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen so that we can get started with my presentation. Hold on one moment. All right. Let's see here. Okay. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my PowerPoint? Beautiful, thank you. All right, so as was mentioned, my name is Naomi Kinjo. I'm a Japanese English bilingual educator in Glendale, Southern California. And I will be sharing about how we can promote reflection regarding bilingual bicultural experiences among our dual language students. And I would firstly like to begin by just learning a little bit about you, our viewers today. So if you could type into the chat the following 3 things about you. I'm curious to know where you are joining us from this morning, what grade or grades you currently teach, and also the languages in your program. Because I'm just curious to know I'm guessing it'll be a wide range, a wide variety of backgrounds. But so if you wouldn't mind taking a second to type those 3 things into the chat. Oh, and I'm like eagerly looking at the chat, trying to see, oh, okay, Vietnamese, awesome. Spanish, French, Vietnamese, wow. San Jose, Spanish and English. Okay, Mandarin, English. I just want to get a feel for like all the languages that we're representing and the different locations. I know we're from all over, which is the beauty of Kabe, right? Okay, middle school. Okay, nice. Oh, okay, oh, wow. And even from Chicago, this is so exciting. Thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. My purpose in sharing with you this unit that I designed, let's see here. Oh, I'm having trouble actually, oh, here we go. Okay, there was just a time lag. My purpose in sharing with you this unit that I designed and actually did with my students last school year is it certainly isn't for me to try and convince you to do the exact same unit in the exact same way with your students, because obviously that doesn't make sense. It won't be meaningful. But I'm hoping to show you ways in which you can also facilitate conversations with your students about their bilingual bicultural experiences. Because I feel like it's truly important for us to do that as bilingual educators. So here's the flow of my presentation. We will be spending a lot of time just getting an overview of the unit that I had designed and actually did with my students pre-pandemic. And I would like to also just give a disclaimer that even though this was done in a regular on-campus environment, you can certainly easily adjust it to any type of instructional method, be it remote, hybrid, or on-campus. We'll then take a look at some excerpts from student class discussions to get a feel for what my students were able to take away from this unit. I'll then have a brief conclusion, but then we're going to have a very quick reflection activity in the chat for you to just jot down your thoughts as to your next steps that you would be able to take. I'm hoping that that'll trigger or at least kind of get us thinking as to what we can do, what you can do in your classroom after listening to this presentation. And then at the end, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to just write that in the chat if you would like, but know that we will have a designated time at the end to address those questions. Okay. I'd like to start by describing my students, so who I teach. Last school year, I was teaching 5th graders in my Japanese dual language program. It is two-way immersion, mixed class, meaning roughly half of the students speak Japanese as their L1, and roughly the other half of my students speak English as their L1. That said, there are a handful of students who speak Japanese and English, or who are really growing up as native speakers of both languages, since they have Japanese and English at the home as well. But yes, so in any case, there's a wide range of linguistic proficiency and linguistic backgrounds in my class. All academic subjects are taught in English and Japanese in my dual language program, and the goal is really for students to become bilingual, biliterate, and bicultural. And when I say these terms throughout my presentation, bilingual, bicultural, biliterate, I mean bi as in 2 or more, because in many cases, many of my students are actually multilingual or multicultural. It's not just Japanese and English or Japanese culture or American culture, right? So my students have a really rich array of linguistic and cultural experiences, but they rarely have the opportunity to reflect and discuss those experiences with their peers in an academic setting. So I wanted to do something about that. And so that's why I designed this unit. So this unit has a very kind of personal beginning in that sense, because I really started with this one question, like, how do my students view themselves as bilingual, bicultural individuals? And this was my starting point, because I thought in order for me to help further my students in their journey as bilingual, bicultural individuals, I really need to meet them where they're at. And so I wanted to create a safe space to let them just talk about how they view themselves and their own languages, their own cultures. So here are just some descriptions as to the personal rationale behind this unit. I wanted to provide that opportunity for self-reflection so that I, as the classroom teacher, could then validate the students' experiences and the complexity among their experiences. I was specifically interested in learning more about my students' language attitudes, which is essentially how they perceive their different languages, in order for me as the teacher to be able to better support them in the classroom. I was also wanting to know about their intercultural competence, and I wanted to further nurture that by exposing them to different cultures, or to, yes, at least one different culture. So that was also my own purpose. And ultimately, through doing this unit, I wanted to create a class culture where students can respect each other as emerging bilingual, bicultural individuals. So the unit has a very personal beginning for me as the classroom teacher, but we can also certainly connect it to a lot of the standards that are out there, such as the Common Core literacy, speaking and listening, 21st century skills, especially the part related to communication, because we're allowing students to discuss their own views and listen to each other. And also, more recently, the California World Languages Standards for Public Schools, which is really about having students become proficient in a different language and gain global competence. So it connects with these standards. And also, furthermore, the unit definitely builds on previous research that has been done about language use, culture, and intercultural competence in the classroom. Because of time constraints, I know we're really short on time, on the amount of time that we have together, so I'm just going to very briefly touch on the previous research that has been done. But what's important for us to know is that the research shows that it's important for teachers to have conversations with their students about their language use in dual language programs. Not only that, but we want students to think about and to explore the relationships that exist among the different languages, the power relations, if you will. Regarding culture, the instruction of culture is just by nature of dual language programs, it's embedded in our instruction, right? Because we can, culture and language are inseparable, of course. But we also, previous studies also suggest that just like we should have students explore power relations about languages, we want students to think about the relationships that exist between or among the different cultures. And then regarding global competence, this is a pretty abstract concept and it's hard to quantify, it's hard to do research on. So there's definitely a lack of research and a lack of just what's being done oftentimes in dual language programs to address this. So that's also a gap from an academic research viewpoint that we can help fill with this kind of unit. And in my case, since I teach in a Japanese English program, there's a lot of research. I'm sure most of you are aware, there's a lot of research out there for Spanish English dual language programs, but not nearly enough for other programs of other languages that are other programs that are not Spanish English. So, and then the visual here at the bottom, as you can see, it just, in a nutshell, this unit is really focusing on the students' language attitudes, their different cultures. So really a lot of their just prior knowledge, and then helping them kind of come up with developing their skills for discussing those bilingual bicultural experiences in order to create at the end this respectful classroom culture. Okay. All right, so now we're gonna just dive into the overview of the actual unit. What does it look like? Here are the goals. So students will be able to explain culture and language attitudes using concrete examples. I wanted my students to know what exactly those are before they start actually reflecting on their own experiences. And then ultimately, the summative performance task in this unit was for students to have student-led small group discussions in which they reflect on and explore their own bilingual bicultural experiences. So here are the actual objectives. Okay, so there are content objectives and a language objective. The content objective, of course, focuses on having students building on their prior knowledge about culture. And in my case, since this unit incorporated Uruguayan culture, I wanted to let my students become exposed to a culture that they really had no prior knowledge of. And since I had the opportunity to take part in, it's called the Fulbright Hayes Seminar Abroad. It's a teacher summer seminar that allows teachers from the US to travel to a foreign country and learn about a different culture. So I had the opportunity to travel to Uruguay, South America in the summer of 2019, and I wanted to incorporate what I had learned about Uruguayan culture into this unit. So that's why some of the objectives here on this page, as well as some things on other slides, will address Uruguayan culture. But again, if you were to do something like this with your students, I mean, please choose cultures that are, of course, meaningful for your students, okay? But so that's why the first content objective addresses Uruguayan culture. And it as you can see here, we wanted students to identify examples of surface culture and deep culture. And I will be explaining what that distinction is in a minute. The second content objective, we wanted students to compare and contrast language attitudes, so how they perceive their different languages in different domains. So in their home, school, local community. The self-reflection piece was huge. So reflecting on and analyzing their own language attitudes, and then finally discussing those experiences with peers. And the language objective for this unit was really focusing on the communication piece. So conversation, turn-taking strategies. I mentioned that there's a distinction between surface culture and deep culture. Culture is a rather abstract term, and it's kind of a big umbrella that incorporates so many different things. And in order for my students to become aware of the many different aspects of culture, I included in this unit instruction about how we can differentiate or distinguish between surface culture and deep culture to help to facilitate students in understanding the different kinds of things that can be included in this umbrella term culture. So surface culture is things like national foods or music, clothing. There's things that we associate, or how should I say it? These are surface culture are things that are very concrete and tangible that we associate with a group of people. As opposed to surface culture, we have deep culture, which in this visual is beneath the water, right? There's like a big iceberg here. Surface culture is at the top. Deep culture is underwater. Deep culture are the things that we would consider to be unspoken, implicit. They're not explicitly stated, but there are definitely certain ways that things are done that are socially, like there are socially accepted ways in which things are done. So for example, at the chart up at the top, I mentioned concept of time being an example of deep culture, right? So if a party is supposed to start at 8 p.m., is it best for people to arrive at 8 p.m. on the dot? Or do people arrive before 8? Or do they come at 8:30? Because even though it technically starts at 8 p.m., is that what's socially accepted? Like those are the things that would be an example of deep culture. It's unspoken, but there are ways in which things are done that are cultural. Okay. So surface culture and deep culture was embedded or included in the instruction of this unit to help students come up with concrete examples as to what culture is. For the most part, my students had never had experience articulating in an academic way the cultures that they're familiar with. And so this distinction definitely helps with that conversation. All right, and I am trying to go to my next slide, but I wonder, I'm having trouble actually. Oh, here we go. Okay. So the learning plan, this unit itself was 4 weeks, and each week we had a different essential question. The first week, it was really just introducing students to the surface culture of Uruguay. And I didn't mention at first that it was surface culture, but I started by just introducing cultural symbols related to Uruguay. The second week, the essential question was focusing on the distinction between surface culture and deep culture. We did activities like making a web about Uruguayan surface culture. And we also did a comparison chart in which students jot down different examples of Uruguayan deep culture. And then they also had the opportunity to share their prior knowledge of other cultures that they know of. And it could be any culture that they have knowledge of. So they were really able to tap into their prior knowledge and share with the class. Third week, how do language attitudes and linguistic experiences affect each other? So we kind of switched gears to language attitudes. We did a gallery walk for students to have some time to reflect and share their language attitudes and reflect also on their linguistic experiences in a written way. And then the fourth week, we focused on the student-led small group discussions that essentially kind of let students demonstrate their knowledge that they have gained from this unit. Before we actually look at the student work and the student conversation excerpts that I have, I want to take a second to share some of the materials that were used. So one resource that was really helpful, there's this book, I have the cover here, called Cultural Awareness. And this book provides all sorts of different activities that you can do with your students to facilitate exactly that, like cultural awareness. And one particular activity that we used in my 5th grade classroom from this book was this page here, which provided all sorts of visuals of different hand movements. And then students had the chance to share what these hand movements mean. And these are gestures, and gestures are extremely cultural, and they're an example of deep culture because they're used, but they're used and rarely really spoken about, right? It's just a natural part of how we communicate. But when I say natural, it's also very culturally relative. So this activity enabled students to become aware of how much we take culture for granted, and especially things like deep culture. I wanted students to come to that realization without my saying that culture is taken for granted. And so activities like this enabled students to notice that or to pick up on that without my explicitly saying so in my instruction. This is the comparison chart that I mentioned before, where students compared and contrasted between Uruguayan deep culture and the cultures that they know. We also did a language attitude diagram when we were exploring our own language attitudes. I modeled this. So this is my language attitude diagram. I modeled this, and then students made their own. But we started with ourselves as an individual in the middle of our diagram, and then we had different layers. So I had the school layer and then the community layer, and then in each layer we talked about, or we reflected on the different languages that are being used and our thoughts and our feelings related to each of those languages. So for example, in my case, I use Japanese and English. Japanese was the language that I associate with home, with speaking to my mom, because my mom is the native Japanese speaker between my parents. And I associate it with being just warm and talking about feelings because it was really the language of my home growing up. Versus English was always the language that I associated with school, with reading oftentimes, and then with my dad, who's the native English speaker, since my dad is American and my mom is Japanese. At school, school in my case growing up definitely valued English because classes were all in English. And then in the larger community, growing up in the Twin Cities, I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hmong was valued in the Hmong community, but then in other domains, it was basically English. So this was my example as far as language attitudes and the different layers in which we exist. And this kind of visual allowed for students to think about and process how they view their own languages, how they use them in different domains, and how each domain kind of influences themselves in terms of their self-perception regarding their language use and how they identify with their languages. And the student-led small group discussion was, of course, student-led, but I did create a list of discussion questions beforehand that, and we made sure that students were familiar with the content, of course, since this was kind of the culminating task of the unit. And not only was I observing and listening to their, or not only was I listening to the content of their conversations, but students were also aware that I was observing how they were having their conversations, because I wanted them to work on their turn taking, and I wanted them to really listen to each other and build on each other's ideas. And so we had this kind of rubric that really laid out explicitly what I was looking for as they were conversing. And in this way, students were very much aware of what I was looking for as they were doing their small groups. And in order for me to accurately assess them in their performance in these small group discussions, we ended up like video recording each of the small groups, because that was the only way that I could actually like accurately assess how they were performing as I was floating around in the classroom. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the student takeaways. This is something that a student wrote as his note when he was taking notes before the actual small group discussion in week 4. And he wrote, "One language is more important than the others sometimes. For example, when I'm in Japan, I value Japanese more. At home, I value English more. At my grandparents' house, I do sign language." So I love how this student picked up on the relativity as far as when he thinks of what languages are important for him. It's truly just relative to the context and who he's with, which is absolutely true for anyone who's bilingual. And he picked up on that by himself through the process of the self-reflection. Some students or some small groups bonded over the fact that they are nervous about using Japanese. So we had this small group, and I'll read what they mentioned, but they were all kind of building off each other's ideas about how they are nervous speaking or writing in the target language in our program, which is Japanese. So student 1 mentioned, "I get nervous when writing in Japanese. I want to say something, but I'm too nervous to say it because I'm not Japanese. I sometimes rush because I don't want to do this or that." And then after that, student 2 mentioned, "I get nervous when speaking in Japanese. I agree because I plan it out in my brain, but I say wrong words and get embarrassed. Both languages are important, and both languages in our case, in our program, would be Japanese and English." Student 3 mentioned, "I agree with student 1 because my mom always says that I have to write more than everyone and I get nervous. I agree with both of you because English is easier for me and I don't want to speak in Japanese." I thought this conversation was extremely telling, just because as the teacher, knowing that these students feel uncomfortable speaking in Japanese, we as a program can then work on, well, then how can we make these students feel comfortable during Japanese instruction, right? Of course, we can pick up on these language attitudes oftentimes through just observing our students, but if we let them have these conversations, it's just extremely telling. So that's why I wanted to share this with you. We also had a debrief after all of the small group discussions were done. We had a whole class debrief where we touched on a few questions. And during that time, we addressed this question: is it important to be aware of different language attitudes? And one student mentioned, "I think yes, because you can communicate with more people and you get to know more about other people. if that person doesn't understand a language, you can speak to them in the languages that they prefer, I think. So this student is really describing the notion of accommodation, which is what bilingual individuals do. Once we know what language the other speaker prefers, we're able to accommodate, and we decide to use that language because we have more than one language under our belt. So I thought it was great that this student has this like heightened awareness through doing this unit of how they're able to use different languages in their linguistic repertoire to form connections with other people. And on the note of forming connections with other people, another student who was also addressing the same question actually provided an example of how you can use your different languages also to accommodate in that sense. I think it's really important because maybe a person you meet only speaks, you're in Japan, you can speak English and Japanese, and you meet someone who can speak English but speaks it very poorly, but your preferred language is English. To form a connection with that person, you'll have to use Japanese. So if you can be aware of your own language attitudes, you can also be aware of other people's language attitudes, which makes it easier to make friends, form connections, among so many other things. So I love how this student really highlighted the importance of being attentive, not only to our own language attitudes, but how that enables you to be attentive to other people's language attitudes, allowing you to build stronger connections with others. So my personal takeaways from doing this unit are the following. So teaching about culture gave students the tools to discuss and articulate their own cultural knowledge and experiences. That distinction between surface culture and deep culture in this unit allowed for the students to provide concrete examples, not just from Uruguayan culture, which we explored together as a class, but also of all sorts of examples that they were aware of from outside the classroom. And there was extreme enthusiasm for the student-led discussions because it allowed for them to really share their own personal experiences with each other. So I thought that the level of enthusiasm and just seeing that and feeling that made this unit and the activities worthwhile. I mentioned towards the beginning that this unit had a very personal beginning for me as a classroom teacher to want to get to know my students. But in the end, and this is the third takeaway for me, it really was also a learning opportunity for the students to learn more about themselves and to realize the diversity that exists among their own experiences growing up with two or more languages and cultures. And ultimately, I do feel that this was able to help develop my students' global competence and also just create a safe atmosphere, a healthy class culture for them. So those were my personal takeaways. And now we are at the point in my presentation where I want you to take a moment to reflect on your takeaways. When I briefly went over previous research that this unit builds on, I mentioned, it's important for teachers to talk about language and culture in the classroom in dual language programs, right? I want you to take a second to reflect on these two things that are here on the slide. So the first is your takeaway from this presentation. And also the second would be, what would be an activity that you'd like to try or a specific question that you'd like to ask your students in order to get them thinking about their linguistic and cultural experiences. So take a second to think about these two things. And if you wouldn't mind, please type in the chat your takeaways. I'm curious to see what you see your next steps being after listening to what I have done with my students. Okay. So I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to give you a little thinking time so that you can type in the chat. And yes, I will be sharing the slides, by the way. I see that question. Mhm. I love it. I'm seeing a lot of takeaways from this presentation being just like needing to spend more time, or just the importance about talking about these topics with students. I could not agree more. Oh, I'd love to try this as a unit. Oh, that makes me so happy. If doing it as a unit is too much, you think? I mean, even doing 1 or 2 activities would be very powerful as far as learning about your students. Learning 1 or more languages. Ooh. Oh, because all of you are typing at the same time, I'm not able to like read everything all at once, but I will be taking my time to read this once we're done. I'm really curious to see. Yes, giving students more credit. Yes, about wonderful. I love it. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. It's so easy in dual language programs to constantly feel like we're just short on time, right? And getting so caught up in the instruction that we need to do, which makes sense. Of course, we're teaching language and content, and it's hard. It's not, there's so much that we need to cover. But at the same time, I feel like it's just as important to really learn about our students and to give them the tools to articulate how they see themselves in their bilingual bicultural journey. Because that in itself, to let students articulate how they perceive themselves as bilingual and bicultural, I mean, that's empowering for them. And you can build on that through your instruction, and you can cater your instruction appropriately by knowing by knowing more about your students in that way. Okay. So thank you so much for joining us, for joining me in my presentation. I guess we have, I'm looking at my clock, we have just a couple minutes here. Questions, brief Q&A time, if there are any. Yes.
Naomi, we had, I wrote down a few questions. I'm going to read them to you.
Okay.
2 of them were about sharing the slides, but there was another one from Henry K. He said, I am interested to hear your thoughts on the comparison of the culture behind monocultural experiences and multicultural experiences. Specifically, how does a student understand their culture if it involves 2 languages at the same time?
Ooh. Okay, so comparing monocultural experience with bicultural experience, is that right?
I will write it on the chat again.
Okay.
Because I don't think I did justice to it. Here it is.
No,
Here's the
okay.
question.
Comparison of the culture behind monocultural experiences to bicultural experiences. Oh,
So that
okay.
that was my question. So
Yeah.
just the context would be someone who maybe they experience both languages at the same time. I think you mentioned that before, where you have some students who are growing up early on learning both languages,
Mhm.
and of course along with that the two different cultures at the same time. So that experience compared to, like, let's say someone who um, only has one particular language that they're working through growing up.
Mhm. Okay. So comparing their cultural experience, is that right?
Like I guess how um, when you have that discussion with a student like that compared to another student who, when that discussion happens in the classroom, like, do you notice things that they share? Do they feel like they can share about that? If it's like two or more, it's, there's a lot going on at the same time.
Yes, there's certainly so much going on. When we did our small group discussions, I intentionally kind of grouped students in a way that that how should I say, like I was aware of the students' backgrounds so that we would get a nice mix of cultural experiences and linguistic experiences. So when I compare, okay, so when I reflect on what students were discussing and the differences I saw, when students were talking specifically about Japanese and English linguistic experiences or cultural experiences pertaining specifically to Japanese culture and American culture, the students who were growing up with both languages and cultures at home, in addition to attending our dual language program, I mean, since they're really growing up with both languages and both cultures, their understanding of both was extremely deep, and because they're essentially being immersed in it. It was interesting to see how they were able to use that knowledge and use those personal experiences to provide empathy to the students who are growing up monocultural but attending our program. Because a lot of times in the small group discussions, the students who are growing up with either just English or just Japanese at home, they really need to work hard, of course, in our dual language program when they're learning in the other language, which isn't necessarily the case with the students who are extremely proficient in both languages because of their family background, right? So I was wondering how that kind of conversation would unfold in the small groups that are completely student-led, but it was wonderful to see those students who are truly bicultural being able to what's it called, to say that, like, oh, I completely understand, like, yes, it's definitely certainly not easy to work on and to become proficient in a different language. So they were really able to validate the experiences of the monocultural students. I feel like I could go into so much more detail, but I know we're limited on time here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Naomi, we are out of time. Did you want to provide the link to your slides for those?
Absolutely, yes. So I have the link. The slides are uploaded onto my Google Drive, and what I'm going to do is I have the link for you to access that. So,
okay.
And I set it up so anyone who has the link should be able to view it.
Awesome.
The PowerPoint. Yes. So there's the link in there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are out of time. Remember that the next session starts at 10:40. So please look at your schedule. And again, thank you. Naomi has put the link in the chat if you would like to access her slides. So I'll give everyone about 30 more seconds before we end the session.
Thank you. And I realized we didn't have a lot of time for Q&A. If you have more questions, I am just copying and pasting my personal email into the chat as well. So if you would like to reach out to me, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Naomi. Have a wonderful day. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Arigatou
Bye.
gozaimashita.